Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage!
Hey guys, big surprise, I'm back in the garage again. It's weird, it's early December, and even though I'm cold out here, I'm not nearly as cold as I was in November. Got a couple days in a row here where it's unseasonably slightly warmer than it should be. It seems like it's much warmer than it should be because we've had for a long time temperatures in like the 30s and the low 40s, which is much colder than it should be. And so when it hits 50, it seems like a heat wave almost. But that's in fact a little bit closer to probably what it should be this time of year. But the last couple, 2-3 days, whatever, when we hit some temperature slightly warmer than it should be, it actually felt like it's nearly the springtime again, which it's not. So I'm out here again. I have my shorts on, so I'm kind of cold, and I don't even have my hot tea with me or anything. I should put that out of my mind. But it's like, yeah, I'm always coming out to the garage for various things anyway. Pretty much every day I'm out here for something. And I have storage here and gallons of water and things like that I keep out here, as well as music supplies and guitar cables that I bring back and forth. So I'm always having to come out here for various things. And coming out here today, again late afternoon, it's a little bit warmer than what it should be, really. And again, now I watched the weather forecast. It's this could be it. I keep saying that, I know. Maybe I just shouldn't say it anymore. And one of these days, my Tales from the Garage won't be a Tales from the Garage. It'll be a Tales from inside the house. But I think this is the last one for this year. Anyway, I'm just going to go back and do what I do and select another batch of albums and hope that I have some memories of them. And hopefully maybe they're things I actually have on compact disc. It seems like all my recent pulls have been a lot, like 75% of things that I don't have on compact disc. So I haven't heard them for years. So let's see what happens this time around and see what I can remember from my memories of what I do pull. Well, we're starting right off the bat with an ECM. So the tide has turned. This is one that I bought as a cutout. Can you see the notch there? Where's the notch? There's the notch. There's the notch. This was a cutout, $3.99. The funny thing is you rarely saw in mainstream record stores cutouts of ECM records, because I don't think ECM didn't do a lot of cutouts of new still sealed albums. This was one of them. Definitely bought in a record store. This is before the internet, but I don't know where because there's no record store sticker, and all I know is I paid $3.99 for this new and sealed Steve Tibbetts, his Safe Journey album. Not bad. I don't think I have this. I'm pretty sure I don't have this one on compact disc. I'm not a huge Steve Tibbetts fan. I like his first album that he did, which I can't recall. I can picture the cover in my mind, but I can't recall the name of it right now. The first album he did for ECM. Not YR, even though ECM ended up re-releasing that. But it was the album Northern Song. I think it's called Northern Song, that I really like a lot. This one I like, but I didn't buy the CD. Not enough to really go out and buy the CD. It's got a slightly expanded band. I think a lot of people would like this probably a lot more so than Northern Song. Northern Song is more of a kind of lonely, slightly more sedate, I think more avant-garde album than this. This is a bit more percussive, a bit more of the electric guitar kind of soloing in there. Has like a full rhythm section, whereas Northern Song, I think, was just, pretty sure that was only Mark Anderson playing various congas and bongos and those kind of things. I think those are the only two guys on Northern Song. I really do like Northern Song. This was recorded in 1983. And once again, Steve Tibbetts on guitars, kalimbas, and tapes. So he was doing a lot of almost, I guess, music concrete type of backing for his kind of the backdrop, I think, for some of the pieces, which is where the tapes comes in. Mark Anderson again on congas, steel drum, and percussion. And there's a bass player, Bob Hughes, and a tabla player, and it says vase, but I think it's vase. I think it's a Indian instrument, percussion instrument. I'm not sure. By Tim Weinhold and Steve Cochran on tabla. So this one is a lot more, I would say, conventional, maybe a bit more in the fusion direction, you know, with the kind of slightly distorted electric guitar doing solos. So it's a bit more on the conventional side. Not a bad album at all. And I think a lot of people that maybe find ECM2 heady music might like this, because this is earthier. Not a bad album, though. Not a bad album. Haven't heard it for ages, though, so can't say much about it. $3.99 was certainly a steal. Where do I go? Where do I go? I'm going to pull this. What is this? Ah, interesting. My very, very first Tangerine Dream album. So we're covering a lot of Encore. I'm not sure. I think I had Edgar Frosa's Ages album, solo album, which was also a double album before I had this. But I'm not sure. I recall back in the day hearing David Bowie, if you're familiar with his Low album, the second side especially. There was a radio interview that went around to various radio stations, because Low was quite a departure musically for Bowie, especially the second side with the instrumental stuff. And Bowie had done a radio interview that was distributed to various radio stations, and he talked about his influences in kind of creating that music at that time, which would have been 76 for Low, 1976. So Bowie was talking a bit about his influences in that direction. And I'm sure he mentioned Brian Eno, who participated in Low and also co-wrote some of the material. But Bowie spoke specifically about Edgar Frosa, which is why I think I ended up getting an Edgar Frosa album first, even though he did reference Tangerine Dream, and I knew Edgar Frosa was the leader of Tangerine Dream. So I got Ages. I think before this is 77. This is their famous double live album. This is a little bit, I don't know. In my memory, I seem to think of it as being worn, but it doesn't look all that incredibly worn. Not as bad as I thought it was. It's got it's 2 records, so it's got 4 tracks, 1 track per side. Now, by the time I got this, I was already heavily into Klaus Schulze. I don't think I knew at that point that Klaus Schulze had played with Tangerine Dream, simply because that kind of information wasn't out there before the internet, and there weren't books written about Tangerine Dream, and there weren't books written about Klaus Schulze. So I think it was a couple years after this that I discovered that Klaus Schulze, who I already had probably at least a half a dozen albums by, had been a member of Tangerine Dream. So I've been listening to Klaus Schulze and his early stuff, because that was all that was out then, his first probably 8 or 9 albums. I didn't have them all, but the ones I had, Airlicht, Time Wind, Mirage, albums like that. So by that time, I was heavily into those. And those 3 albums specifically that I knew I had by Schulze didn't have any drums in them. They didn't have any guitar. So it was a departure away from the kind of rock stuff that I had grown up with. So getting back to this album, by the time I got this, I had already discovered the slightly more experimental, esoteric, maybe, side of Klaus Schulze. And to me, this is almost like a step back, because there's some very heavily sequenced stuff in there on this album, and some kind of screechy, rocky guitar solos, especially one side. I think it's the third side, That's really just got a long Edgar Fresa electric guitar solo, which really does nothing for me. But I still found it interesting from a live perspective. This is before the days when I, discovered many years later that a lot of Tangerine Dream's live albums were extremely redone in the studio, extremely reworked with a lot of recording done in the studio, and apparently this one is no exception. So when they say this was recorded during their North American tour, March, April 1977, apparently one has to take that with a huge grain of salt, even though I'm sure there's sequences in here from those live performances. And it does. It sounds pretty good. I was interested in it from a live performance aspect when I initially bought it, for just 3 musicians, primarily playing keyboards. So it was a very unique. That was, back in 1977. That was a fairly unique thing. First of all, to have an all keyboard band and a band that didn't have drums. They did have some electric guitar, but a lot of the times it was just the 3 musicians. And this is the classic lineup of Edgar and Chris Frank and Peter Baumann. And so a lot of the times they're just playing the 3 keyboards, just the 3 of them playing keyboards on stage live. So it kind of interested me from that point of view. In some ways, conceptually, as this kind of performing electronic keyboard ensemble, I found that in a way more interesting than some of the music on here. Some of the stuff is not bad. I tell you, it does come to a grinding halt for me. That one long piece with the electric guitar, it didn't do anything for me even back in 1978 or whenever I bought this. But I've got this thing, when I pull out an album to listen to it, I don't skip tracks. Even the stuff that I can't stand, I listen to. So, this is one that, I would listen to all of it. And it's only about, it fits very nicely on a single CD because none of the 4 tracks actually equals 20 minutes. So this is like maybe about maybe a 70-minute album, somewhere in there, 70, 72, 73, something like that. For a lot of people, this is the best lineup of the band. For a lot of people, this is probably really their most popular that the band got, because they were kind of edging up. Think about the way radio was in the U.S. back then. I don't think they would have gotten much play on any kind of rock radio stations, but maybe, who knows, maybe a little bit at night, in the wee hours of the morning, 2, 3 a.m., some adventurous DJs working in a freeform station might play this stuff. This is probably still more college, university-oriented cult band at the time. But a lot of people were into them at this time specifically. And I can recall hearing about them and seeing them mentioned in various places, in magazines and things like that, long before I ever heard the band. So they were kind of in the public consciousness of folks, young people especially, who were, into things that were a little bit beyond the mainstream rock progressive stuff at the time, but not that far out. So even though their music actually got increasingly commercial in the 90s and the 80s, but especially in the 90s, I think they were actually more popular in terms of record sales and just the public awareness of the band being around actually in the late 70s, because they were kind of seen as this unique thing. So a lot of people really like this album. I'm not so much a fan of it, to be honest. I probably haven't listened to it for a couple of years, but now, not pulling it out and talking about it, I have the CD of it, so I could be tempted to give it a spin. But I think that one probably ranks for a lot of people's favorites. I know a lot of longtime Tangerine Dream fans certainly prefer that specific lineup with Peter Baumann and Chris Frank. I really do like Chris Frank a lot myself. Okay, I'm going to continue. The hell is this? Well, I finally pulled out one I can't talk about. Ray, I'm not even sure how to pronounce his name. Ray Buttigieg or Buttigieg. This is an electronic album. I'm fairly sure. Jesus, I remember seeing this in my collection and having it. It's on an obscure little label. And I'm fairly sure it's an electronic album, but boy, I don't remember much about it. Original sound recording composed, performed, arranged, and produced for Ray Buttigieg for Cyclics Productions. Ray Buttigieg, Nearing the Millennium, oddly enough titled, Symphonic Poem Number 3 is the album. Here's one. I'd be surprised if anybody watching this has this one. I don't even know. This was... There's no sticker on it. I must have bought this, though, in a record store. And I saw it, and it looked interesting. It's from 1984. And there's absolutely no information on here about when it was recorded, who the musicians are, so I'm guessing it's just Ray on his own. No instrumentation. There's just a poem on the back, and the poem doesn't tell you anything. And it's for this little tiny record company, I guess, but it came out in New York. It came out of New York. Lenox Hill Station, New York. Psychics Productions, CYKX Productions. I think it's electronic. I don't know where, I would have found this in this. So there's absolutely no information. I didn't play it enough to memorize it, I can tell you that. That doesn't mean it's a bad album. Okay, on the label, though, it does say composed, performed, and produced by Ray Buttigieg. So I guess he played everything on there. But there's no instrumentation listed. And it seems like it's just basically two long tracks. Symphonic Poem Number 3 and Nearing the Millennium, though there's movements listed. Each side is about just under 22 minutes each side. I haven't heard this in, I'm sure, at least 30 years. So there's a first. I know I bought it, guys. That's probably a first, that I can't speak much about this album at all. I should look this up on Discogs, though, if it's even there. And I bet you this is probably amongst one of the most obscure albums I have. Unfortunately, one of the most obscure albums I have was one of early Philip Glass albums that I left in my basement when I moved. It's long gone. I didn't realize it was there, but putting two and two together, and I know it's not in my record collection here, I realized that there was this early Philip Glass album that he had put out himself, I'm fairly sure. It wasn't on a major record label. And I got it out of the import section of a record store in the late 70s, but it really wasn't an import. It came out of New York City, where Philip Glass lives. And I'm sorry I didn't keep that one, because I bet you that one's ultra rare now. I can't even remember the name of it. Well, here's a sequel to the last Tales from the Garage. Doing a random play. Here's an album I can talk about. Last time I pulled out my very second favorite album by Azimuth. Here's my first favorite album by Azimuth. And in fact, their first album. Azimuth, this is an ECM recording, so we got in 2 ECM recordings in this episode. Recorded March 1977. Now, I got this probably, I don't know, 1979, 1980, maybe even as late as 81. Not long into my discovery of ECM records. And this is, I'm sure, the first Azimuth album I bought. And it was, for me back then, quite a jump into the abyss in a way. Because a lot of my early ECM things had guitars on it and drums and things that I could either play or relate to, kind of coming from the rock world, or synthesizers or something. But this doesn't have any percussive instruments. There's no bass, there's no drums, there's no guitar. I talked a lot about Azimuth on the prior video because I pulled out their second album. But when I see the date of March 1977, it strikes me now how long ago that was, as old as I am. That was my my senior year, my final year in high school. when they recorded this. And it was a few years after that that I discovered it, because when I was in high school, I wouldn't have been listening to music like this, I can tell you. My all-time favorite Azimuth album, and the only album that I'm ever aware of where keyboard player John Taylor, who primarily plays piano, played synthesizer on. Very, very early monophonic synthesizer that has a very early sequencer on it, which used on about 2 tracks, a fairly repetitive monophonic sequencer going, and it works really well. He plays a little piano over the sequence. Sometimes the sequence is going on its own. Sometimes trumpeter Kenny Wheeler is playing over the sequence. Some of the most effective stuff, though, is when vocalist Norma Winstone sings over this electronic sequence, because even if you're familiar with her solo work, even in her solo albums, she doesn't play with synthesizers. So it's very interesting hearing vocalist Norma Winstone, who's the only person actually still around from this group, who's still alive. It's very interesting hearing Norma Winstone singing over this electronic backing. Very much, again, a night album. I think pretty much all their albums are things that are made to be listened to in the dark, in the evening. It's got a couple long pieces on there. It's got the title track, Azimuth, which is over 12 minutes, a 9-minute piece, an 8-minute piece. So there's fairly long pieces that are there long enough for you to get lost in. And again, it's a trio of the late Kenny Wheeler on trumpet and flugelhorn, Norma Winstone on voice, and the late great pianist John Taylor also playing synthesizer. John Taylor wrote all of the music on this one, though I think there's a very brief trumpet piece that was written by Kenny Wheeler, a 2-minute piece. But it doesn't state that on the back here. It says, all composed by John Taylor, the lyrics by Norma Winstone. There's lyrics on only a couple songs on the album. Most of it is her wordless vocals. So again, an interesting group of piano with some synthesizer, voice, and trumpets, and no rhythm section or anything. Let me look on the vinyl here. All composed by John Taylor. I thought Kenny Wheeler... No, it looks like John Taylor wrote all the music on here, including this little trumpet thing that's for overdubbed trumpets on here. Though I know Kenny Wheeler did do a little bit of writing for a later album of theirs. Of course, I can't get the vinyl back now. Yeah, I remember buying this album. I bought this locally in a record store that was a small independent record store. So I remember buying this one because I didn't do a lot of shopping there. This independent record store that was only about the next town over from where I lived. Most of my record shopping was done at malls or stores that were good 10, 15 or more miles from my house. But this one was a little independent record store on this kind of like a local main street in this town. And actually in the town of Teaneck, where it turns out Milt Jackson lived, the Modern Jazz Quartet vibraphone player, but I didn't know that at the time. And there's this little independent record shop there that for about a year or two I shopped at a lot, and I'm sure they're gone now. Run really by just one guy. And of course this one has the old ECM catalog in it. So I bet you he probably picked up that album when it was first released, and it probably sat in his store for waiting for me to buy it for 3 years or so. Because as most stores were done at the time, local record stores, I'm surprised he had an ECM at all, actually. It was more geared toward pop music, though there was still, a sizable jazz and classical section. I don't remember how big the classical section was, but there was a decent-sized jazz section, considering that jazz wasn't nearly as popular. Great album cover, which I've questioned before what that is exactly, and somebody on one of my older videos, I had shown this and spoken about this album before, told me exactly what that is. It looks like just a life, what do you call it, like a marker, like a lighthouse thing almost. Somebody told me it's actually like a hotel, but I don't know. I have to go back and look at my own videos to recall what that was or is. Great, my favorite album by Azimuth, and probably my favorite John Taylor album as well. That he was a great pianist. I have a handful of things he did as a sideman, and a handful of things he did as a leader on his own, away from Azimuth. But Azimuth is my favorite thing that he did. He's a great pianist. He's a great supporting pianist for other musicians like John Sermon, the saxophone player. But John Taylor also did quite a lot of solo albums of his own. A lot of them were in the jazz trio setting with bass player and drums, so a fairly standard trio. But he also did some interesting albums, and he did one that I have with him on church organ. So it's almost electronic sounding, kind of almost eerie at times. Him on church organ, and I want to say, I think it's Ian Carr, the British trumpeter on trumpet, just the two of them. I can't be 100% sure, but I think it's Ian Carr on trumpet and John Taylor on this huge church organ for the full album. So it's kind of almost like an otherworldly thing. And also he did a few solo piano albums, which for me might be slightly more interesting than the jazz trio thing. It's hard to do a jazz piano trio with bass and drums after all the stuff that's come, and really keep it interesting. So I might prefer to hear John Taylor say solo piano, but he never picked up a synthesizer again, unfortunately. I think it would be interesting to hear what he would have come up with. And again, when both him and Kenny Wheeler passed away, I was kind of surprised because they were both active right up until the time that I was aware of anyway, of their passing. Not like they had stopped playing and you think, oh, okay, well, they're old and they stopped playing, so maybe that's not a good sign. Okay, so it's, once again, the last time I'm out here for the year. I shouldn't say that. Tomorrow, the weather should start really falling and staying where it's too cold to be out here. And at that point, I'll just continue on from inside, but there won't be random vinyl polls. And there I'll be talking about, I don't know, I might just end up talking about what I'm listening to currently type of things, because I don't have a kind of set format like I do when I'm out here. Okay, guys, well, thanks for watching. I know I've been really piling a lot of videos lately, but that's only because I'm kind of jumping on the opportunity to be able to do it, because I know it'll be at least April before, probably maybe even late April, until I'm able to be out here again. So thanks for watching, and I will be back very soon, probably inside. Take care.
Tales from the Garage is brought to you by Monster Out. Just spray it once a day throughout your home and keeps all monsters away, even invisible ones. Say goodbye to ghoulies, goblins, gremlins, mummies, vampires, and the living dead. Not effective on witches, chicken men, or rhino girls. And by Smoky brand cigarettes. 9 out of 10 doctors recommend smoky cigarettes to their patients. Remember, gals love a smoky man. Smoky, the key to great taste. Tune in next time for more
Tales from the Garage.